Okay, let me just get started, and then if people are coming in late, I'll try not to say anything interesting or important for some time. Today I want to finish off talking about behaviourism and Ryle and his what he says in chapter 2. I just want to look at a couple of passages mainly, because I talked a bit about his position, and I think it's quite good just then to look at the passages. And then if we got time, I'll start talking about identity theory. This was the sort of about kind of in the 1950s, 1960s, this sort of became the dominant position in Anglophone philosophy. And there's two papers that were written, short papers by Smart and by Feigl, that were written about the same time, that both basically sort of defend a similar view. And I'll talk about those papers on Thursday. And then next, and I think the identity theory, it's interesting to know historically, and I think it's useful to see how functionalism, when it first came on the scene, was setting itself both against identity theory and against behaviourism. I think it's useful to see how it works. I think one of the things also about these articles is if you're not from a philosophy background, you might find them a bit weird, the Feigl and the Smart. And I take it really, what's really central in these papers is they're taking this notion of the distinction between sense and reference that was introduced by Frege and applying this to questions about the mind. And I think this sort of Frege in the background is something that you might miss when you're reading the papers. So tomorrow I'll say something about Frege and how this relates to the positions. And then next week we'll start talking about functionalism, and we're going to look at this classic article by Putnam, and then we're going to look at another classic thing by David Marr, who's a psychologist who introduced this idea of levels of description. And we'll also talk about the chapter from Heil. Now, one thing was with Heil, I think I quite like the Heil book. I haven't taught it before. This is like the 4th edition. It's a sort of a fairly standard mainstream sort of introduction to the philosophy of mind. If you're coming from cognitive science, I didn't include chapter number 7. So chapter number 7 is on the representational theory of mind. And for those of you interested in cognitive science and like reading and have lots and lots of time, which I guess is none of you, chapter 7 in the Heil might be interested in. And someone asked me, could I stick the whole book online? So I stuck the whole book on the Moodle. So if any of you kind of found it useful or wanted to read more, yeah, it's there to do. Okay, so there aren't many of you. Yeah, we've got like 20%, 25% of students, or no, maybe a bit more than that. But yeah, it's still it's still not great. Hopefully more people come next time. Okay, so let me talk about, yeah, and then tomorrow there's a few things I want to talk about from the identity theory, and there's a bunch of the stuff in the reading we're not going to get to. So if there's anything particular that you had questions about, they come with sort of prepared questions, because I'm just going to point to a few things from Feigl, and then when we run out of time, I'm going to be like, oh, that's it. But if there are particular questions you've got about the identity theory readings, then yeah, come and bring them next class. Okay, so I'm trying to share the screen. So as I suggested, that Ryle is often presented as this kind of paradigm example, or one of the main guys who was a sort of behaviourist. And behaviourism, as it's sort of taught in intro to philosophy textbooks, is really taken as a sort of as something driven by semantics, driven by an account to offer an account of the meaning of mentalistic language. Yeah, and driven by concerns in the philosophy of language. And as I've suggested, that Ryle, I think, isn't really like this. So in chapter 1, I take it he's far more driven by epistemic notions than he is by semantics. I think it's the sort of epistemic stuff that's doing the work. And I think that he thinks that that Cartesianism, as it sort of developed after Descartes, has a very strong epistemic side to it. Because the distinction between public and private, between the public physical and the private mental, is basically, you can think of as a sort of epistemic distinction. Yeah, the public-private distinction, you might think, is that metaphysical? Seems to me that it's a sort of epistemic distinction between two different ways we can have access to things. So I take it that chapter 1 is attacking Cartesianism, and it takes Cartesianism to be committed to a certain sort of epistemic notion of the privacy of the mental. And that's really the kind of main target, I think, in chapter 1, this problematic distinction between the mental and the physical understood in terms of publicly accessible and privately accessible. Yeah. And so I think that's what's driving chapter 1. And I think in chapter 2, what's driving, and this is also part of his attack on Cartesianism, is an attack on what he calls the intellectualist tradition. Yeah. So, and the intellectualist tradition is a tradition that places knowing that, theoretical knowledge, before knowing how. And I take it that Ryle in chapter 2, his sort of motivation, once again, isn't really semantic, but it's got to do with thinking about the relationship between theory and practice, and how, in some sense, practice is prior to theory, that thinking is just one particular type of practical activity. Yeah, and so knowing how is basic. And so this is, we talked about this last time. I just wanted to run through now. I hope most of you have read it. Who has read this chapter? Oh, who didn't? Okay, so for those of you who didn't, I'm giving you the highlights from the text. And in some sense, it's like, oh, I didn't read it, but I've got the best bits from class. And those who did read it, that we'll go through the text and I'll say a bit about it. It will help you remember. And I just want to focus on a few things. So he introduces this kind of this idea of what he calls the intellectualist tradition or the intellectualist legend. He traces this back to the Greek idea that immortality is reserved for the theorizing part of the soul. So the Greeks thought that what really made us human was our capacity to reflect, and this was understood in terms of theorizing, in terms of knowing that. And he thinks that this carried on within the Christian tradition. And in this tradition, who wants to read this? Anyone in a place where they can read something aloud? Okay, Hasnun.
The highlighted part, right?
What? Yeah, they were predisposed.
Okay. They were predisposed to find that it was in the capacity for rigorous theory that lay the superiority of man over animals, of civilized man over barbarians, and even of divine mind over human minds. They thus bequeathed the idea that the capacity to attain knowledge of truth was the defining property of a mind. Other human powers could be classed as mental only if they could be shown to be somehow piloted by the intellectual grasp of true propositions. To be rational was to be able to recognize truth and the connections between them. To act rational was, therefore, to have one's non-theoretical propensities controlled by one's apprehension of truth about the conduct of life.
Yeah. So I think this is another part of what he takes to be the Cartesian tradition that he's rejecting, that he thinks has its roots in the Greek world. And on his reading, he in Oxford in the 1940s, that Ryle is one of the founders, in some sense, of analytic philosophy, of the coming kind of the Oxford tradition. But he was a kind of classically trained scholar. His background was in classics. And he thinks that, yeah, you've got this idea with the Greeks that basically elevates theory over practice. The mental is theoretical, is grasping things theoretically. That it's the capacity for theoretical knowledge that separates us from animals. Yeah, we're able to come up with theories. Yeah, civilized men over barbarians, and the divine mind over the human. So the divine mind, what does the divine mind do for Aristotle? The divine mind is pure contemplation. It's thought thinking itself. It's pure theoria. Yeah. So Aristotle has this famous argument about what's the best life, the life of theoria or the life of practice, the life of theory or the life of practice in the Nicomachean Ethics. And Aristotle argues that the theoretical life is the best life, the life of what is sometimes translated as contemplation, yeah, the life of theoria. And this is the most divine life, because God is a thinker. And what's God going to think about? Well, God's the best thinker. And what's the best thinker going to think about? The best thing. And what's the best thing? Well, he's the best thing. So God is going to be a sort of thought thinking about itself. It's going to be this pure activity of contemplation, of sort of theoretical self-knowledge. It's sort of, it's above action. Action is a bit dirty. When you act, you know, thought gets immersed in the dirty world. You get your hands dirty when you act. And so there's this sort of idea that he traces back to the Greeks, that the capacity of theoretical knowledge is the defining characteristic of mind, is what makes us human. And then practical action is sort of parasitic. It's a sort of bastard offspring. It's a sort of stepchild of theory. Yeah, and rational action inherits its rationality from the rationality of the thought upon what it's based. Yeah, so to be rational was to be able to recognize truth and connections between them. So you have a capacity to recognize truth, and then you have syllogisms, which is basically looking at the connections between two truths. You draw conclusions. I know that P is true. I know that if P is, and then Q is true, I draw the conclusion Q. That's what's really at the heart of reasoning. And then, according to this intellectualist view, to act rationally was therefore to have one's non-theoretical propensities, one's capacities for action, one's desires, one might think. So you've got these desires that are, that are non-rational, but these are sort of controlled by one's apprehension of truth about the conduct of life. And there's a sort of, I take it that we might think that the modern version of this is going to be the moral philosophy that is based on principles. So according to standard accounts, this is Kant, this is Mill. So, that according to Kant, that to act rationally is to act on a maxim that can be universalized, a particular type of maxim. But the maxims are the principles of our action. They're the so one has some sort of principle that one recognizes theoretically as the principle that should guide one's action, and then one sort of applies it. And this is something you find in Kant, but you also find it in most schools of utilitarianism, where you start off with some theoretical principle that what one should do is maximize total happiness. That's a principle that's grasped by the intellect. And then you might think that acting rationally is to apply this principle or to act in accordance with this principle. So first of all, you have this theoretical grasp of a true practical proposition. Yeah, one should maximize total happiness. One should only act on a maxim that can be universalized. And then rational action is to be understood purely in terms of the sort of application of this principle. Yeah, you have pure ethics and applied ethics. Pure ethics involves grasping the principles, and then it's a matter of putting these principles into action. And this is something that Ryle, like Hegel, wants to reject. The ethics isn't a matter of grasping true principles and then applying them, but it's a matter of having a certain type of know-how. And so this is the view he's sort of very much against. And here's his sort of response. Intelligent practice is not a stepchild of theory. So a stepchild, we've got some Germans here. So in German kind of, do you have this in Turkish? Like it's the stepchildren who are always being sent into the forest by the kind of nasty stepmother to be eaten in gingerbread houses. You know, like you've got the stepmother is it's your father's new wife. Yeah, so you've got this kind of, do you have that image in kind of Turkish?
Yes, we have actually.
Yeah. Kant has a nice phrase. He sometimes talks of stepmotherly nature, you know, like cruel nature. It's a nature that doesn't really love you. Yeah. Yeah. So intelligent practice is not a stepchild of theory. It's not like you've got, yeah. On the contrary, like the unloved child of theory. I think that's not true. I think stepchildren can be equally loved. If any of you are stepchildren, I hope I didn't trigger any of you. Yeah. So on the contrary, theorizing is one practice amongst others and is itself intelligently or stupidly conducted. So theorizing is just one particular type of practice. Yeah. Theorizing is something we do. Yeah. And it's something we can do either intelligently or stupidly. And doing it intelligently doesn't involve having an intelligent plan and then applying it. Yeah, that it's got to do with how you engage in it. Yeah. And I think this is the second big thing in Ryle. And I mean, one reason I want to focus on this is we're going to be looking at Carruthers, and Carruthers basically takes this Rylean idea and then looks at recent empirical evidence for it, the idea that's going to come up. But I think that there are, according to the kind of classical representationalist view, so we're going to look at Mart next week, the idea is first of all, we represent the way the world is. So we have a system to come up with a sort of representation of the way the world is. Then we have a bunch of desires, and then we sort of work out how to get the world to match with our desires. And that's all something that goes on in a sort of theoretical, it's something like a theoretical inner space. Yeah. And then, you know, once we've decided what's the best way of achieving our desires, which is a sort of theoretical question, we then kind of have to kind of send a message to the motor system to put it into practice. And so I think that there's a kind of standard way of thinking about human cognition that does buy into this intellectualism. I think the standard kind of computational understanding of the role of perception and action and how the individual systems work buys into something like this. And I'm quite sympathetic to views that have a more action-orientated view towards perception. Yeah, so that it's not like we first have a theoretical representation or a set of beliefs about the way the world is. Yeah, but that the function of perception is to kind of guide action, and it can do this in sort of real time. And so the sorts of accounts of the relationship between perception and action I like are ones that I think accept some of these Rylean challenges to this intellectualist picture. So one of the people we're going to be looking at is Gibson. And I think Gibson is a kind of psychologist who is driven by a desire to reject something like the intellectualist picture of intelligent behavior, and in particular, intelligent, perceptually guided behavior. So when we come to Gibson, I think Gibson's in the same camp as Ryle here. And I think that someone like Mart, who we're going to look at next week, if you think about how his understanding of perception works, I think he does buy into what Ryle takes to be a sort of intellectualist picture. So, and I think that I think the next paragraph is just a really fun one. So I just want to read these two paragraphs for those who didn't, and those who did read it, maybe you skimmed over this. So does anyone want to read this paragraph?
I can read if you will.
Okay. So and then I want someone to read the one afterwards as well. So there is another reason.
There is another reason why it's important to correct from the start intellectualist doctrine which tries to define intelligence in terms of the apprehension of truths, instead of the apprehension of truths in terms of intelligence. Theorizing is an activity which most people can and normally do conduct in silence. They articulate in sentences the theories that they construct, but they do not most of the time speak these sentences out loud. They say them to themselves, or they formulate their thoughts in diagrams and pictures, but they do not always set these out on paper. They see them in their mind's eyes. Much of our ordinary thinking is conducted in internal monologue or silent. I don't know how to pronounce
Silent
it.
soliloquy. So a
Soliloquy.
soliloquy is, if you've seen if you've read a play by Shakespeare, yeah, a soliloquy is where an actor talks to himself, but out aloud. Yeah, so you know, Hamlet is there, the most famous soliloquy in Shakespeare. Do you know, how does it start? To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the heart to blah, 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 blah. Yeah, that one. Yeah. Whether to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to yeah. Most of our ordinary thinking is conducted in internal monologue or silent soliloquy, usually accompanied
by internal cinematograph, show of visual imagery.
Yeah, so, and I think it's this fact that leads us to think that first of all, we have this kind of theorizing. So I think, like, it's easy to think that this inner monologue is kind of something purely theoretical. It's just a grasp of truth. Yeah. And so I think to make sense of his position, he's going to he needs to offer a non-Cartesian account of what's going on in the inner monologue. And he offers this in the next paragraph, and then in a couple of weeks, we'll come back to this idea and we'll look at some contemporary, more empirical work done on this stuff. So why don't you carry on, because this is the same argument. Now it's his reply. Do you want to carry on, or does someone else? We'll say now.
Shall I keep reading? Okay, I can. This trick of talking to oneself in silence is acquired neither quickly nor without effort. And it's a necessary condition of our acquiring it that we should have previously learned to talk intelligently aloud and have heard and understood other people doing so. Keeping our thoughts to ourselves is a sophisticated accomplishment. It was not until the Middle Ages that people learned to read without reading aloud. Similarly, a boy has to learn to read aloud before he learns to read under his breath, and to prattle aloud before he prattles to himself. Yet many theorists have supposed that the silence in which most of us have learned to think is a defining property of thought. Plato said that in thinking the soul is talking to itself, but silence, though often convenient, is inessential, as is the restriction of the audience to one recipient.
Yeah, so let's remember that the Cartesian thinks that thought is private. Yeah, and I think it's this fact that underlies the thought, that when we think, we're sort of talking to ourselves and no one else hears it. But Ryle's point is that the silence of thought is not essential to the thought. It's just a contingent fact that we've learned to engage in. So in order to think silently, and here's an empirical claim that I think we're going to see has some evidence, that in order to think quietly to oneself, one has to first learn to speak aloud. Yeah, so one first has to master outward speech. One learns to speak aloud, and then one learns to speak aloud, but cutting off the sound. Yeah, and so private silent thought is just the same as public. It's just basically public speech that is is in some sense castrated, in some sense the expression is cut off. Yeah, and so talking aloud is a version. It's just a type of thinking, and it's a type of thinking that is public. So I'm talking to you now, and I'm thinking as I'm talking, and what you're listening to, what you're hearing is just thought. You're hearing thought in progress. And it happens that this type of thought is thought that is accessible both to you and to me. Yep. Now I can close my mouth and then I can think about what I'm going to say next. Yeah. And maybe I can do that without saying anything aloud. Maybe I'm not very good at this. Those who know me know I'm not very good at not talking. So even when I'm thinking by myself, my lips will be moving. So my wife will realize when I'm thinking because my lips will be moving without me realizing it. And he's got some evidence for this. So it used to be that, I mean, reading silently is a real achievement. We think that reading is something you do silently, but it wasn't something that was mastered until the Middle Ages. Saint Augustine, in his Confessions, his autobiography, he was amazed. People were amazed by St. Ambrose, who was the Archbishop of Rome, because he could actually read a letter silently, and no one else could do that. People saw him and were like, oh my God, this guy can read not aloud. Yeah, we take it for granted that reading silently is how you read. Yeah, so we take this silent reading to be the sort of paradigm of reading. But this took generations to learn how to do. And it's something you've acquired through massive education to read quietly, yeah, to read without suppressing it. And as you first, when children first read, they have to read aloud, and then they stop it. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure about deaf children. I know some people work on, in Boazaji, work on sign language. So I'm wondering about deaf. Do they sign as they're reading? I'm just wondering if there's something similar with this. So yeah, reading and speaking, we take these as kind of something as grasp of a proposition, and we take it as something theoretical. But we take speaking aloud to be clearly a sort of activity. Yeah, and if you think that speaking silently and thinking silently is parasitic on speaking aloud, this is going to make know-how and praxis in some sense prior to theoretical understanding. Theoretical understanding is just a sort of action that is not allowed to express themselves. In ancient times, you have all of these famous stories of, someone being sent a letter by two messengers. And of course, when you get a letter, you have to read it. And of course, you would have to read it out aloud. Yeah, so when you get a letter, and courts were open places. So, there's all these stories of people sending things by code in the letter. Yeah, because that only one person would understand, because the idea of someone getting the letter and reading it privately, this is something that people couldn't do in the ancient world, or very few people could do. So, yeah, and so he thinks that rather than looking at semantic features, he says the combination of the two assumptions, first of all, that theorizing is the primary activity of minds, and that theorizing is intrinsically a private, silent, or internal operation, yeah, he thinks remains one of the main supports of the dogma of the ghost in the machine. Yeah. So I take it that and these two things, so I just take it seems quite clear to me that Ryle isn't primarily motivated by these sort of semantic concerns that are motivating what's become kind of canonically known as I take it what's motivating it is a certain type of pragmatism, certain sort of practice first view of mentality. Yeah. So any questions about that? Because I'm going to move on to the next section. Okay, Hasnun.
I still cannot fully understand why he says that. Like, why when yeah, we can articulate our thoughts and theorizing, but I don't understand. I mean, I think like the act of thinking and act of articulating what we are thinking are two distinct things, and like, I mean, I still cannot understand how like thinking itself is the act of theorizing itself, or at the part of theorizing itself, because like I feel like they're different separate things.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I got the question, but I mean, at the moment, he hasn't given us, I mean, it's not obvious if he's given us arguments. I think the sort of claim that learning to think quietly is something that is an achievement that we have to be taught how to do. I think that's a bit of evidence for the idea that this idea of inner silent thought is primary. Sorry, inner silent thought is not the primary locus of intelligence. So the Cartesian, as he's got it, thinks that this silent inner thought is the beginning of intelligence. It's the source of intelligence. But if it turns out that in order to do this, you have to learn to think aloud and publicly first, this pushes against this particular version of Cartesianism. Now, my guess is that his target may not be a target that is now a plausible target in psychology. I don't know, because his view of Cartesianism is that the Cartesianism he's attacking is a view that thinks of thoughts as conscious inner episodes. Whereas I take it like today, there's a sort of version that's akin to a sort of theory first view, but says that we have these inner representations that are sort of subpersonal representations. And in order to act intelligently, we need these sort of inner representational states that are kind of maybe representations of have propositional content. But these inner states, I think, according to this view, are not conscious. Yeah, they're sort of states, they're kind of, sentences in the language of thought, to use the sort of, yeah. And that's a sort of, so there might be a view where you think that in order to speak intelligently, you need to have some inner representation, where this inner representation isn't a kind of conscious belief, but it's a sort of representation in the brain. Yeah, it's a sort of mental representation understood as a sort of a sentence in the language of thought, as a computational state of the organism. And that's a view that I think his argument doesn't push against, because it's not a view he's considering. Because the kind of Cartesian view that is the opposition is the view that it's these conscious inner states that are the paradigm of intelligence. Is that I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I think so.
I mean, and against the kind of Cartesian view he's against, he thinks we've got this one argument that's based on the fact that learning how to think quietly is an achievement, but then he's got a second argument that has to do with the idea of the worry about the possibility of an infinite regress, because inner thought is itself an activity, and therefore in order for it to be intelligent, it would have to have some prior thought as its cause, yeah, all the way back. Now, I think if you've got the idea that you've got sentences in the language of thought, intelligent action is caused by intelligent mental theoretical states, but these are not conscious. This sort of blocks those sort of arguments. Yeah, so, and this is not a view that I think he reacts against. Hesna, you had a quick question, and then Okay, so there's two other paragraphs I wanted to look at in this section. In this section, and then I wanted to talk a bit about the clown. And we're running. I've gone on a bit longer than I wanted to, as usual. I think one thing that's one thing where I think he differs from is one thing I think where his view. So often people motivated against Cartesianism are motivated by a kind of, you might think of as a hard-headed physicalism, where they want to offer an account of the mental in purely naturalistic scientific terms. And then I think these guys in the 50s and 60s and 70s had quite a radical fact-value distinction. So if you want to offer a scientific account of the mind, it had to be purely in terms of physical things. And these types of explanations can't involve any unanalyzable normative content. Yeah. So you want a purely scientific descriptive account of the mental. Yeah. So I think in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, after Ryle, that one of the big motivations in the sort of philosophy of mind was a kind of desire to be able to cash out the mental in terms that were non-mental, first of all, non-mental, so physical, but also in terms that were scientific, with the idea that science doesn't involve any normative notions. Yeah, so that you're going to cash things out in purely descriptivist terms. And I take it that once again, Ryle isn't in this game, because I think for him, knowing how has an essentially normative aspect to it. And this is something when we come to Sellers is going to be important. But I take it that knowing how is normative in the sense that it's got success and failure conditions. Yeah. And so here he says on page 17, he says, what is involved in our description of people as knowing how to make and appreciate jokes, to talk grammatically, to play chess, to fish, or to argue. Part of what is meant is that when they perform these operations, they tend to perform them well, correctly, or efficiently, or successfully. So I take it that if you're going to give an account of the mental that's appealing to knowing how, then you're going to need a whole bunch of normative notions. You're going to have notions of doing things well, correctly, efficiently, successfully. These are all kind of notions that involve some sort of normative evaluation. You need some account of what it is to do something correctly, what it is to do something well. Yeah, their performances come up to certain standards or satisfy certain criteria. Yeah, that so I think there's something about that. There's something I think that Ryle thinks that there's something about the mental that is essentially normative, and that I don't think, like many of these sort of people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were trying to offer these sort of scientific accounts of the mental that were only appealing to kind of scientific language. And if you're doing science, there's no room for standards of correctness or some idea of performing something well. Yeah, so he says this is not enough. The well-regulated clock keeps good time, and the well-drilled circus seal performs its tricks flawlessly. Yet we do not call them intelligent. We reserve this title for the persons responsible for their performances. Yeah, to be intelligent is not merely to satisfy criteria, but to apply them, to regulate one's action and not merely be well regulated. A person's performance is described as careful or skillful if in his operations he is ready to detect and correct lapses, to repeat and improve on successes, to profit from the examples of others, and so forth. He applies criteria in performing critically, that is, in trying to get things right. So the person who kind of is able, who has these sort of mental attributes has a certain type of skill, and this skill involves the capacity to recognize when one fails. It involves the capacity to apply normative criteria. Yeah, and this is a difference between a parrot and a comedian. They can both say the same words in the same circumstances, but the comedian or the human being has a skill. And what's distinguishing between a creature with a skill and a creature that isn't exercising a skill is that someone who's exercising a skill has a capacity to detect and correct lapses, to repeat and improve on successes, etc. So I take it that what I'm trying to stress here is, I take it Ryle's account is not meant to be a reductive account of the mental, whereby we reduce the mental to something purely physicalistic. Yeah, I think some of the people in the 50s, 60s who were following Ryle picked up on the ideas of dispositions, and they thought we can understand dispositions purely in physicalist, non-normative terms. But I think for Ryle, once again, this is my kind of semi-Hegelian reading of Ryle, is that mentality exists within the realm of objective Geist. It's the mental is something that it exists in a sort of normative sphere. Yeah, you're not going to get mentality without some sort of normativity. Yeah, and this is something that it's not really just Hegel. This is something that the sort of people I like in the analytic tradition also pick up on this. So people like Brandom, people like Sellers, people like McDowell, people have come across these people. The sort of all three of these guys are at Pittsburgh or were at Pittsburgh. So there's a sort of Pittsburgh school of sort of analytic Hegelians who want to stress the fact that the mental cannot be captured and understood in purely naturalistic terms, if what we mean by naturalistic involves removing any sort of normativity. And then of course the problem becomes, yeah, how do we account for this normativity? And I think there's various ways to go. One might try and understand it socially, so that the norms are not individual, but they're norms of a group. This allows you to maybe offer a naturalistic account of normativity. There's something like social norms. That language is a normative thing. With language, we have kind of successful and unsuccessful application. You can misapply a word. Yeah. The very notion of a representation, I take it, is a normative notion. And this is the big problem in the philosophers trying to offer a plausible naturalistic account of representations, is that you can misrepresent. So representations that can't be explained purely causally, because to represent something, you can, I can represent the presence in a fly in the environment, but that can be caused by a black dot on a moving dot on a Apple phone. Yeah. So I take it that notions of representation and these basic mental notions are normative notions. And I think this is something that Ryle himself seems to buy into. Knowing how is, it's an epistemic normative notion. You have criteria of success. Hold on, how much time have we got left? Okay, let's look at this very quickly then, look at this infinite regress argument. Yeah, so I think here on this page, on page 18, we've got a nice little argument that thinks that the intellectualist tradition, in some sense, gets caught in a sort of infinite regress. And at some point, you've got to think of that insofar as you think intelligence is possible, there's got to be some capacity to act intelligently that is prior to sort of, in some sense, thinking theoretically. Yeah. What's that? Okay. Yeah. So he says, the point is commonly expressed in the vernacular by saying that an action exhibits intelligence if and only if the agent is thinking what he is doing while he is doing it. Yeah, so intelligent action involves thinking about what you're doing. And then you might think that means that intelligent action involves two things. It involves both thinking and doing. Yeah, so intelligent action involves thinking about what you're doing. Therefore, intelligent action involves two things, thinking and action. And then you might think what makes an intelligent action intelligent is that it was caused by the thought. So you've got the thought and the action, and what makes the action intelligent is that it's caused by a thought. Yeah, so, and this popular idiom is sometimes appealed to as evidence in favor of the intellectualist legend. Yeah, so champions of this legend are apt to re-assimilate knowing how to knowing that by arguing that intelligent performance involves the observation of rules or the application of criteria. Yeah, so first of all, and if this is the case, then first of all, you've got to represent the rule or represent the criteria and then apply it. And then it follows that this view then, I think, leads you to an infinite regress. Yeah, because the representation of a criteria is itself an action. And then do you need some other criteria in order to be able to represent the right criteria? And then do you need a rule for the representation of the rule? Yeah, so the sort of idea here is that rule following, at some point, there has to be a basic capacity of acting in a rule-governed way that doesn't first require, in some sense, representation of a rule. And this is a topic in the last 20 or 30 years, died off a bit now, but there was, this is a topic that is very central in Wittgenstein, that was taken up by Kripke in his second big set of lectures, which is about Kripkenstein. People call it about Kripkenstein, which is the kind of mashup of Wittgenstein and Kripke. But he has a book of lectures. He has a book on Wittgenstein and rule following. This is a big issue, and I think this is the sort of, I think once again Ryle is in the same camp as Wittgenstein here, and is offering a similar type of worry. So he says, it follows that the operation which is characterized as intelligent, if the intellectualist is right, must be preceded by an intellectual acknowledgement of these rules or criteria. That is, the agent must first go through the internal process of avowing to himself certain propositions about what is to be done, maxims, imperative, regulative propositions, as they are so called, and only then can he execute his performance in accordance with these dictates. He must preach to himself before he must practice. Oh, I think I talked about this passage last week, yesterday, yeah? Last week. Did I? No? Okay, so this is, I like this. So according to the intellectualist, he must preach to himself before he can practice. Yeah, so you must give yourself an inner kind of preaching before you can practice. The chef must recite his recipes to himself before he can cook, according to him. Yeah. The hero, I think this is an appeal to this Kantian idea. The hero must lend his inner ear to some appropriate moral imperative before swimming out to save the drowning man. Yeah, so moral action involves, first of all, listening to this theoretical thinking, what is the principle here? Oh, I should save drowning people when they're drowning, and then acting upon it. The chess player must run over in his head all the relevant rules and tactical maxims of the game before he can make correct and skillful moves. To do something thinking what one is doing, according to this legend, is always to do two things, namely to consider certain appropriate propositions or prescriptions. Yeah, so propositions, inner sentences or inner principles, rules, and to put into practice what these propositions or prescriptions enjoin. It is to do a bit of theory and then to do a bit of practice. Yeah, and the worry is here is that then this leads to an infinite regress. So this is yeah, so this is, he carries on like this, and then we have, this is on page 20. Yeah, So we have this regress. So he says, according to this legend, whenever an agent does something intelligently, his act is preceded and steered by another internal act of considering a regulative proposition appropriate to his practical problem. But what makes him consider one maxim which is appropriate rather than any of the other thousands which are not? So first of all, you've got to think of the principle. But thinking of the principle is something you do. And then you need some principle to tell you which principle to think of. Yeah. Why does the hero not find himself calling to mind a cooking recipe or a rule of formal logic? Yeah, if we think that moral action, for example, involves rational moral action involves, first of all, representing a principle and then acting on it, the question is, well, what principle should we think of? There's the act of thinking of which principle is the appropriate principle in circumstances. Yep. And that's an act. And how do we do that? Do we need some principle about which principles to think of? Perhaps he does. But then his intellectual process is silly and not sensible. Intelligently reflecting how to act is, among other things, considering what is pertinent and disregarding what is inappropriate. Yeah. Must we say then that for the hero's reflections how to act to be intelligent, he must first reflect how best to reflect, how to act? Yeah. So if you think intelligence involves, first of all, some theoretical reflection and then action, then must we first of all reflect about how best to reflect? Does it go back infinitely? If not, we've got some idea of intelligent action that doesn't involve any reflection. Yeah. But then why can't the action itself be an intelligent action that doesn't require any prior reflection? Yeah. So must we then say that for the hero's reflections how to act to be intelligent, we must first reflect how best to reflect how to act? The endlessness of this implied regress shows that the application of the criterion of appropriateness does not entail the occurrence of a process of considering this criterion. Yeah, so there may be some criterion of appropriateness, but in some sense, acting appropriately is going to be a certain type of know-how. Acting appropriately involves, in some sense, having some sort of capacity to recognize what the appropriate thing to do is within the circumstances and to just do it. To respond to the kind of circumstances one finds oneself in appropriately. And that's what intelligence is, I think, for Ryle. Intelligence is a capacity to respond appropriately to one's circumstances, which is a type of know-how. And to try and cash this out in intellectualist terms is a mistake. Now, Hasnon, this is kind of, you might just think that, okay, he's right, but we can then explain the capacity to act appropriately in terms of the existence of internal non-conscious representations. Yeah. So kind of, and I take it that this is going to be the sort of position of the computationalist view, that it keeps something of the intellectualist legend, except that the internal theoretical representations turn out to be non-conscious. So in terms of consciousness, it's not like we have to first consciously think and then act, but we've got this sort of subconscious processing going on below the surface. That is, in some sense, is best understood in intellectualist terms, but getting rid of the consciousness stuff. Yeah, so we have these representations of the way the world is and the way the world should be. We have these sort of beliefs and desires, or we have beliefs about the way the world is, and then internal representations of principles. But these things aren't understood in Cartesian terms as things that exist consciously, but are understood as sort of sub-personal mental representations. And this is the sort of view you find in people like Fodor, in the classic computationalist accounts. I take it that there is a sort of alternative. And when we look at Gibson's a sort of psychologist who thinks, at least, who thinks that visual perception isn't primarily there to create internal representations of reality, but in some sense, it's there in the direct service of action. and that what we perceive in the environment are basically possibilities of action and possibilities of meaningful action. And so I think that we know that at least part of the visual system acts like this. Yeah, so we might think that the dorsal stream of visual processing doesn't involve constructing detailed representations of the environment. And so I think Gibson offers a psychologist. So he's a psychologist, he's the kind of founder of ecological psychology, of someone who buys into a kind of account of perception and action that doesn't buy into Cartesianism, not even from the kind of this modified non-conscious version of it. But I quite like this argument in Royal, and we'll come back to this idea of inner speech in a few weeks, and we'll come back to the relationship between perception and action when we come to Gibson. I didn't talk about the clown, and I like the clown. So maybe tomorrow in class I'll just say a little bit about the clown. This is on page 21, 22, and then I'll talk about this identity theory. I mean, for the minimum for tomorrow, try to have read the Smart. And the Smart article is from 1959. It's sort of old school 1950s analytic philosophy. It might be a little bit, I don't know. I talked about the clown and the parrot, but I didn't, there's one passage I think I didn't look at. So I talked about it a bit abstractly, and well, you're a bit bored of the parrot, Ozan? It's like no more parrot. Yeah, yeah, I think it's worth just going on, and I don't think I'll need to spend that much time on it, because I think that have a quick look at the parrot thing. And then I'm gonna, when it comes to the stuff about identity theory, I want to say a few things about Smart. And then there's some other stuff I could say, but apart from the kind of the stuff about Smart and Frege, and I want to say something about the beginning about how he's reacting to behaviorism and the relationship between identity theory and behaviorism. Apart from that, like when it comes to identity theory, I want to say something about type identity and what we mean by this. But so if there are things you had problems with, so I don't know, when you're reading this, I think Ryle is quite easy to read. I think Smart and Feigl are a bit more difficult. And I think that next week, when we come to Putnam, you're going to read bits of Putnam and be like, what? Help? Why is he saying this? So if there are, I think especially with Smart, Feigl, and Putnam, there may be bits where you read a bit of the text and don't really understand what's going on. So if there are bits like that, let me know, and I can try and work through them. And if you do find you're reading it and there are bits of it you don't get, I think part of it is they're writing in a certain type of philosophical context and they're responding to particular positions. And yeah, if you don't get what they're responding to, maybe you'll miss bits. Okay, and I'm not, the identity theorist is just something I just want to point out to. I think the functionalist stuff is more central. For me, the behaviorism and the functionalism are where the action's at. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. And I've got to run because my wife is supposed to be teaching now. Okay, she needs the computer. Okay, bye-bye. Okay.
You should be next to him. He's on his chest. No, that doesn't respond to the